Chapter 5 New Rhythm. Summary. Their new setting takes some getting used to. But hey, what's that? A new souvenir? But maybe they can make it a little more bearable. It took a while to adjust to their new setting. Everything there seemed a little too loud, and Izuku wasn't sure that all the other beings here were intelligent like humans. Their friendlier neighbors were certainly, but some of the sounds emanating from the warehouse seemed a little too wild to be sentient. The constant noise was also starting to grate on the group, overwhelming their senses and piquing already shot nerves. At some point during the first cycle, Mei and Kaminari had tucked themselves into the back of the group. It was plain to see that they were the most affected. Izuku wasn't sure about Kaminari, but he knew Mei had autism and ADHD that could overwhelm her at the best of times. This certainly wasn't the best of times. During the beginning of the second cycle aboard the new ship, one of the new reptilian-looking aliens came up to their cage. The sight of the paralyzing space pepper spray immediately had Izuku and the rest scrambling away from the bars, but it was to no use. A toxic mist filled the air, along with a sound of pressurized hissing. Izuku's rising panic attack, as well as most of his other brain functions, were soon muffled as he was forced to breathe in the concoction before he would have passed out. A familiar feeling of helplessness filled him as he slumped to the ground against his friends' limp bodies, scaly hands grabbing for him first and pulling him towards the now somehow open end of the cage. He could feel that his tattered costume had been pulled down his back slightly, exposing the bare skin at the nape of his neck. Instead of an agonizing pain like he expected, all Izuku felt when they settled his limp body in an upright position was a prickling at the base of his neck. The prickling sensation only lasted a minute, or maybe it had been an hour. Izuku's drug-hazed brain was barely holding on to coherency. Once it was over, Izuku was shoved back to the cage floor as the aliens moved on to the others. He had managed not to pass out this time, but it still felt like forever before Izuku regained feeling in his body. A twitch of the fingers, followed by a bend of a knee. Eventually, Izuku was sitting up along with Mei and Bakugo, the others seemingly less successful in staying conscious after the gas. Now that he could think clearly, Izuku was dreading seeing what happened to their necks. Last time they were knocked out and manhandled, it was a branding. This time, Izuku realized as Mei brushed an unconscious Uraraka's hair out of the way, it was a tattoo. The inky black text stood out on Uraraka's pale, sun-deprived skin. It was slightly different from the text in the brandings, only having about 10 different symbols. Even with his limited knowledge of alien language, Izuku knew. What they had been tattooed with were numbers. Each of them had a unique serial number adorning the base of their necks. The day after the now-dubbed tattooing incident, Bakugo settled into sitting protectively at the front of the group, on guard. At this point, he would at least settle into the group pile without a fuss when dark came. And after a few cycles, the group had mostly adjusted to the shorter days and nights. It had thrown them off at first, but the lights were so bright and the noise so loud that they could no longer sleep through the day cycle, much to their circadian rhythm's chagrin. During the long stretches between periods of sleep, they settled into a monotonous routine. Once a cycle, they would get a measly serving of gruel, and every few cycles the guards would come to renew their quirk suppressant shots. They occasionally tried to chip away at the bars to no effect, never quite losing hope, but there wasn't much they could do. Izuku had noticed the first time the teens were brought their food, the guards gave their two friendly neighbors dirty looks. The second time, however, they seemed to jeer at the small pair, nasty tones clear despite the language barrier, causing the two pastel aliens to shrink in on themselves as the guards pounded on their cage bars. Feeling a swell of indignation towards the guard for terrorizing the helpless pair, who Izuku still had a strong feeling were kids, he let out a shout. "Hey, leave them alone!" he snarled at the two reptilian guards. Izuku knew they couldn't understand him. No one had been able to so far. but he didn't need words to convey his message. If he was right about why their original captors hesitated to approach them when Kachan growled, he would be able to be more than convincing. Izuku menacingly stalked over to the cage bars, getting as close to the guards as he could, and drawing himself as tall as possible within the cage's confines. The previously snarking guard froze and slowly turned towards Izuku. He could hear Uraraka let out a questioning noise behind him, but he ignored her. A protective urge shot through him, similar to when he first met Eri. But this time, if there was something he could do, he wasn't going to sit back and do nothing. Izuku pushed himself closer to the bars and bared his teeth, snarling at the terrified reptile. He knew he was acting a little unhinged, but after getting kidnapped by alien traffickers, shot into space, and held in a small cage for what had to be at least a week, he couldn't bring himself to care. The scaled reptilian guard backed away from the small alien's cage slowly, never looking away from Izuku, but never making eye contact. Izuku, on the other hand, stared down the guard every step of the way until they were out of sight. He relaxed as soon as the guards were gone, turning to look at the two caged aliens with a kind expression. He hoped that the soft smile on his face was as universal as his barred teeth had been. From their slightly less tense stance, his hopes seemed to ring true. Speaking up for the second time that day, Izuku soothingly whispered what would appear to the two as nonsensical words. Thankfully, the kind tone appeared to immediately work, relaxing their postures even more. So he continued, even as the lights began to dim a few minutes later, trying his best to provide any level of comfort to the two in their unfortunate situation. And to Izuku's surprise, the smaller purple one of the two cautiously made its way towards him, getting right up to the cage bars closest to Izuku. The yellow one seemed more hesitant, but soon followed the purple one, right up against the cage wall. The two cuddled up and settled in, closing their weary eyes and appearing to relax into Izuku's calm mutters. Warmth bloomed in Izuku's chest at the sight, and before he knew what he was doing, he had started to hum. It was a song he hadn't heard in years. All that remained of it were fuzzy memories of times long ago. Before his diagnosis, before his dad moved away, before the world became so cruel, as it was right now. But as he let himself drift into the melody, the words began to come back to him. So quietly, barely a whisper, he began to sing. At this point, his eyes were closed, his whole focus taken away by the nearly long-forgotten song. And before he knew it, it was over. The final verse of the song finished, and he at last opened his eyes. Before him lay the sleeping forms of the two delicate aliens, faces smushed up against the bars. And now he noticed the air around them was quiet. Not one conversation could be heard throughout the small warehouse. Izuku immediately blushed after the realization of what he had done came to him. He then slowly turned around to gauge his friends' reactions. What he saw startled him. Over half the small group was teary-eyed, Uraraka having clear tear tracks running down her slightly grimy pink cheeks. But they certainly weren't tears of sadness. A delicate smile adorned all of their faces, even Kachan's, as much as he was trying to hide it. Before Izuku had the chance to speak to them, a voice broke out into the silence. It was soft and melodic as it began to sing a far-off melody. The words indecipherable, yet enchanting. On and on the songs went, some sung by light, whimsical voices, others deep and soothing. As they continued, Izuku could feel his own eyelids growing heavy. And from that night on, everyone trapped in that large room fell asleep to a new melody. Notes. While I love slightly feral Izuku, I feel sometimes people forget how intertwined art and music are in the human condition when writing stories like this, and how music is one thing that overcomes such seemingly overwhelming barriers as language.